Hello wonderful people. Today I wanted to film a video about the difficulties of being undiagnosed, having an undiagnosed condition, because for a lot of people this can be a huge source of stress, understandably. One of the biggest challenges for someone who's undiagnosed can be anxiety about the future and not knowing what to expect. This is because the person doesn't have a given prognosis. They haven't been told whether their condition can get worse or get better because they don't know what their condition is, and that can be a source of anxiety for some people. Another reason why being undiagnosed is difficult is because if you're undiagnosed, you're less likely to have treatment to manage or reduce your symptoms, and they're not going to get to the root because you don't know what's going on. You might have the symptom of nausea and take anti-nausea medications, but then there might be certain symptoms which can't be addressed unless you know exactly what the cause is. And that can be difficult because you might have a severe flare-up and think, if I was diagnosed, I would be getting treatment. But seeing as I'm not, I've just got to try and get through it, really, even though I don't know what is causing it. And another thing is, because certain conditions, when you're diagnosed, you're made aware of common triggers, flare triggers. But if you're undiagnosed and you don't know what your condition is, you don't really know what to avoid that might make your symptoms worse. And you don't know if something in your daily routine is making it worse, and you worry that anything you do could make it worse because you are just living in a state of uncertainty, not knowing what is known to make your condition worse because you don't even know what your condition is yourself. Another struggle with being undiagnosed is worrying that you're bothering or pestering doctors too much. Now, first off, I can say that you're not, but some people do worry about this sort of thing because they might need to make a lot of doctor's appointments to try and get different referrals or try to get answers or just try to be taken seriously and to stop getting dismissed, because a lot of us often get quite dismissed. So, we can worry, are we bothering them? Are we pestering them? Are we calling the doctors too much? Are they going to think we're a hypochondriac? Are they going to think our symptoms are in our head? That's a really big concern for some people, worrying that the doctors are going to think it's all in your head when it's not. Your symptoms are real and the cause needs to be found so that you can get better and have some form of treatment or management. Another issue with being undiagnosed is that other people might see you as invalid, which makes no sense. But some people think that if you have an undiagnosed disability, a disability, but no medical explanation for it, people might think that, oh, you don't really belong in the chronic illness community then, do you? Or they might think, well, it probably isn't anything that bad, blah, 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 blah. People gaslight you more easily when you don't have a diagnosis. And people, for some reason, will say, like, TikTok, oh my goodness, the fake claiming on TikTok is terrible, but a lot of people comment on disabled content creators' posts and say, where's your diagnosis letter so I can see you're not faking? Not everyone has a diagnosis. It's not that easy to get, but not having a diagnosis doesn't mean that someone's faking. We are all undiagnosed at some point or another. And waiting lists to see doctors here in the UK can be very, very long. I was expected to wait 14 months, over a year, to see a neurologist, but thankfully my appointment has been moved forward. I have 4 months, I think, slashed off the waiting time now, and I see the neurologist next month. But I've been dealing with symptoms for a long time with no explanation, so hopefully that'll get some answers. But just because I don't have a diagnosis doesn't mean I don't require support, and doesn't mean that I'm not struggling and I'm not really disabled. It doesn't mean that at all. I require a wheelchair to go out sometimes, even though I haven't got a diagnosis. So it makes no sense to me that people will think, oh, you're not diagnosed, so you're not as valid. That makes no sense, because we're all undiagnosed at some point. And as well as this, even if we've already seen doctors, we might not have a diagnosis because we might be a complex case. They might need to pass us around to different specialists for a while. And again, that adds more waiting time. And sadly, some of us face medical gaslighting, where the doctors will blame it on something pretty ridiculous that's inaccurate. For example, they'll say, oh, it's because you're making yourself ill, you're thinking you're ill, so you are, even though it's something physical. Or them saying, oh, it's because you're vegan. I got that one for my muscle weakness, when it wasn't that at all. But medical gaslighting, annoying, difficult to deal with, and can delay our diagnosis process. One thing that can be hard for some people is not being able to really connect to a community of people with the same sort of symptoms who can give advice, because again, you don't know what's going on. So obviously, if you have a diagnosis, you can search up Facebook groups for it and connect to others. But if you don't know what's causing your symptoms, it's harder to find people who have the same sort of experience. It's harder to find a support group of people who understand. And this is why having an undiagnosed condition can be quite isolating to some people. And as well as this, It is difficult, asking for accommodations and things, because sometimes you need to provide proof of a diagnosis to get accommodations, but if you don't have a diagnosis because of, the issues I've already said, then you might be denied accommodations, which again doesn't make sense, because you can be disabled without a diagnosis but still require a high level of support. So people should be able to get accommodations even without a formal diagnosis, just by explaining their symptoms and the support that they need. And if they do need proof from a doctor, which I don't think they should need validating from an external source, but if they do, then a doctor should be able to list the symptoms, but they don't need to actually have a diagnosis, because not everyone can find the right diagnosis for them, at least not straight away. People might also expect you to explain your disability, and they may say things like, why are you using a wheelchair? I mean, people shouldn't come up and ask that anyway, but for example, or people might ask, why are you in the disabled seating area? Or they might say, on a train, or they might say, why are you not giving up your seat to somebody else? And you might say, oh, I'm disabled, and then they go, well, what condition do you have? Why? And they're legally not allowed to ask that in the UK, but just for an example, if people do ask, sometimes you feel like you need to provide an explanation. And if you cancel plans as well, people might be like, why? What's going on? What's caused this? What condition causes your symptoms? And you might not know. And the difficult thing is as well, you struggle to explain it to others, and other people might assume things as well. If you don't have confirmation as to anything that's causing it, people might assume things. I've had people say to me, you do realize sleep issues can cause muscle weakness, you do realize that a poor diet can cause muscle weakness. I'm like, yeah, I know this, but even when I sleep well and I have quite a healthy diet, I still have muscle weakness to the point where I struggle to breathe properly and require a wheelchair sometimes. So I know it's not those things, but although those people are trying to help, it can be quite frustrating. And also, because you don't have a formal diagnosis, as I said, you don't know what makes it worse, because you don't know what it is. People might recommend things that make your symptoms worse, but you can't say to them, oh, I have this condition, it's actually proven that makes it worse. Instead, you might say, oh, it makes it worse, and then they don't believe you, because I've had that too, and that's very annoying, because I don't have a diagnosis to back me up and say, oh, look, no, it's known to make this worse. And I already made this point, but people might, because they don't know what the condition is, they don't know if it's expected to get worse or anything, that can trigger anxiety in some people. So they might worry, is it progressive, is it degenerative? But they don't know, so they're living in a constant state of uncertainty, and that can really take a toll on some people. When you are undiagnosed, you may have less access to management strategies, because certain conditions, there's tips online of how to manage them. But again, if you don't know what's causing your symptoms, and your symptoms, especially if your symptoms are very generalized and can be signs of many different things, might be difficult to find tips on how to manage, because it can be so many different things that are all managed very differently. And what you have to do then is really just rely on yourself to find out what works for your body. And as well as this, obsessive researching, because some people do research the symptoms, and although people say that's bad, some people feel like they have to do it because they're a complex case and the doctors don't know what's going on, so they research it, but end up getting really confused because they don't know what's going on. They meet the criteria for multiple different things that all resemble each other, and it can be very confusing for some people, but they feel that sense of responsibility, like they have to research it because the doctor isn't giving them the answers that they need.